Friday, January 13. From Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 395, we read, "Whenever God's people, in any period of the world, have cheerfully and willingly carried out his plan in systematic benevolence, tithing, and in gifts and offerings, they have realized the standing promise that prosperity should attend all their labours, just in proportion as they obeyed his requirements. When they acknowledged the claims of God and complied with his requirements, honouring him with their substance, their barns were filled with plenty. But when they robbed God in tithes and in offerings, they were made to realize that they were not only robbing him, but themselves, for he limited his blessings to them just in proportion as they limited their offerings to him." End of quote. The Bible is very clear that we are saved through faith alone, a gift of God's grace. Our obedience to God's commands is a response to God's grace. It doesn't earn it. After all, if it were earned, it wouldn't be grace. See Romans chapter 4, verses 1 to 4. "What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt." Indeed, when we look at God's bilateral covenant with us, we can see both our blessings and our responsibilities. By our responses to what God offers to us, we establish our relationship with him and, to a great degree, determine our own destiny. Obedience, the service and allegiance of love, is the true sign of discipleship. Instead of releasing us from obedience, it is faith, and faith only, that makes us partakers of the grace of Christ, which enables us to render the obedience that God asks from us. And that brings us to our 3 discussion questions for this week. 1. It has been said that if every Adventist were faithful in returning tithe, our church would have more than enough money to do all it needs to do for spreading the message. What are you doing in terms of tithes and offerings to help the church do what it has been called to do? 2. Dwell more on the idea of how important our choices and our works are in our relationship with God. How do we keep the questions of works and obedience, including tithe-paying and good stewardship, before us, but without falling into the trap of legalism? And 3. In class, talk about the question at the end of Tuesday's study regarding when hard times come, even when we have been faithful. How do we understand that if this happens, and how do we keep from being discouraged when it does? And now it's time for our mission story for this week, read by my niece Sibylla, who, like me, is also a volunteer. Thank you, Sibylla.
Making a Deal with God by Andrew McChesney. Dmitry Begal, a student from Russia, ran out of money several months after enrolling in the Masters in Theology program at Friedenau Adventist University in Germany. His options seemed limited. He could work on campus or in a nearby retirement home, but the income would only partially cover his tuition. As a foreigner, he could not take out a state loan like the German students, but he could apply for a scholarship, which was smaller than the loan but did not require repayment. As Dmitry prayed over the dilemma, he felt impressed to make a deal with God. "Lord," he said, "if you bless me with this scholarship, I promise to set aside a second tithe to support mission work." Dmitry applied for the scholarship and, to his joy, it was approved. He began setting aside a second 10% of his gross income for mission work. As the semesters rolled by, he was approved for the scholarship again and again, and he kept giving a second tithe to mission work. Despite the second tithe, he still somehow always had enough money to cover tuition and other expenses. He even was able to set aside money for an emergency. Then Dmitry's 5-year-old laptop began to act up as he worked on his master's thesis. Twice he had to buy spare parts to self-repair it. One day, he found that he could no longer close the laptop screen. The hinges refused to budge. A new laptop was needed if he hoped to finish his thesis, and he was glad to have the small emergency fund. But as he prayed about the situation, he remembered a friend, also from the former Soviet Union, who was serving with his family of 5 as missionaries in the South American jungle. High humidity had ruined his friend's tablet, and a robust device was desperately needed to continue his work. Dmitri couldn't understand why he was thinking about his friend in South America when he was the one in need of a laptop to graduate. But he bought a waterproof, dustproof laptop and mailed it to his friend. Shortly after sending the package, an online advertisement popped up on Dmitri's laptop screen that offered the very hinges that he needed for the laptop. He ordered the hinges, and after installing them, the screen opened and closed like a new one. Amazingly, the laptop still works today, 8 years later.
This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful. And here is a disclaimer. Contents of these lessons are not intended to be financial advice, but is general commentary based on biblical principles. The reader is encouraged to seek competent professional advice which will suit their particular personal situation.